5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, this session is entitled Creating a Community-Based EE Coalition Using the NAAEE Guidelines. Janine?
I'm Dr. Janine Hess, and I teach at Western Kentucky University.
And I am Dr. Terry Wilson, and I'm a retired professor from Western Kentucky University as well. And we are really, really happy that you're joining us today. We're going to be talking about some things that we're doing in the Bowling Green, Kentucky region, utilizing some of the things we've learned from the relatively new guidelines on community engagement. So our contact information is there for both of us, and I believe, Janine, all that information will be provided at the end as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And do you want to say anything else about yourself?
So I've taught at Western since 2005, and I have a doctorate in environmental sciences from Oklahoma State University. And I've taught both undergraduate and graduate students here at Western Kentucky, and have taught some of the environmental education courses for graduate students.
All right. And I'm Terry Wilson, and as I said, I'm retired. I had a wonderful 47-year career in environmental education, the last 28 years of which was at WKU, where I was the director of the Center for Environmental Education and Sustainability, taught some of those environmental education courses that Janine was just mentioning. And I'm really, really happy to be here with you guys. I'm looking forward to sharing some of the things that we've been doing. And from a personal note, after spending most of my career working with teachers and teacher education and preparing people to teach in the environmental education area, what we're looking at right now is kind of new, because we're working primarily on community-based programs that aren't necessarily working with schools. So we're looking forward to sharing with you today. Here are some of the things that we'd like to accomplish today with you. First of all, we want to give you a little bit of an idea about where we are, and there's some reasons for that. Secondly, we'd also like to make sure that everybody is familiar with the NAAEE guidelines for excellence. We know that there are probably people joining this conference, perhaps from all over, that maybe have not used those or are not familiar with them. So we'll talk a little bit about them, because that's what got us going in this particular project. And as a part of then using the community engagement in guidelines, we'll describe something called asset mapping, which is something that Jeannie and I learned when we went through a training on the community engagement guidelines a couple of years ago. And we'll talk about how we've used that here in our area, and then look at where that has led us in terms of identifying some new organizations, new individuals that we didn't know about, and also how those people are becoming more and more connected. So that's kind of what we're looking for in the next 25, 30 minutes or so. I would like to give you a little bit of an idea as to where we're located. I know there are people here from all over, and if any of you went to the conference last year, which was in Lexington, Kentucky, I'm circling that right now with my cursor. That's in what's called the Inner Bluegrass, or the Central Kentucky region, very much famous for all of its thoroughbred horses and all that sort of thing. We are down here to the west, southwest of Lexington, and Bowling Green is the city that we both live in. Western Kentucky University is there, and a number of other things. If any of you are as old as me, or maybe not quite as old, you may remember that NAAEE had a conference over in this area of Kentucky back in 1981 in that Land Between the Lakes area. But just in case you were there, that's where you were with regard to us. what I wanted to share more importantly, though, was how we identified what we were going to be about in this community-based project. And so again, looking back at the map, we are in the Barren River region, which is actually a division of the state that was done for development reasons. But the Barren River is actually a river that is a river that flows into the Green River, which is one of the 8 major river basins in Kentucky. And I did want to briefly kind of look at the map with you on that, not so much to point out any kind of detail with regard to the river systems, the hydrologic systems here. But what I think is real interesting when you do look at the map is we're right down here in this western, south central area. And as you can see, there's a space there that's just, you don't see anything. You don't see anything in terms of significant streams and rivers. And there's a good reason for that. And the reason for that also has a lot to do with some of the things that we emphasize in environmental education in our part of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So let me just move from that slide to one that shows you that the reason we're not seeing surface streams and surface rivers in that area is because we're in an area that's very much of a karst topography. If you're not familiar with that, basically all karst means is that you've got rock underneath the surface of the land that is dissolving. In our case, primarily limestone that's dissolving over time. And when that happens, you get lots and lots of caves and you get sinkholes. And as you'll see in a moment, Mammoth Cave National Park is one of our partners in our project, and they're just up the road from us a little bit. And there are lots of other caves that are in our area. Plus there's a significant situation related to sinkholes. In fact, if you look at this slide, you'll see that the very, very dark brown on the slide is showing areas in our state that have high risk of sinkhole collapses. So if you kind of put all of that together, we're looking at an area of the state that doesn't have a lot of surface streams. It doesn't mean we don't have water. It doesn't mean we don't have streams and rivers. Just a lot of them are underground. But it does present some challenges when it comes to things like water management. There's not a lot of percolation of soil, the percolation of water that goes through soil, I should say. There's also some challenges when it comes to waste and waste disposal. So that's kind of where we are. I will also point out, and this is just kind of interesting, I think, and maybe a little bit, maybe fun isn't the right word, but Bowling Green is also known as the place where Corvettes are built. All the Corvettes in the world are built at a General Motors plant here. But also what you're looking at is actually a portion of the National Corvette Museum. And just a few years ago, actually in 2014, inside that orange sort of conical shaped building that you see, there used to be a display of some very valuable and historically significant Corvettes. There were actually 8 of them in there. And one morning about, I don't know, 3 or 4 in the morning, a sinkhole developed, and this is what ended up happening. All 8 of those cars essentially went into the sinkhole, some covered up with a lot of stuff and others not so much, but a couple of $1 million worth of damage right in the center of the museum. Those of you who work in museums can only imagine what that would have been like. I share that because it was totally unexpected, and that it's very often difficult to know about what's going to happen when you have this kind of karst topography, particularly as it relates to things like water and waste. So what we did is we decided that since we have this sort of unique situation in terms of topography, geography, hydrography, that maybe that would be a place for us to start. And so the people that we got involved with in terms of creating our community-based organization fall within the 10 counties that you see on this map, which is just really a subset of what you were looking at earlier. Okay. Janine.
All right. So Terry and I both attended the NAAEE conference in Spokane, Washington, a few years ago. And enjoyed a training on the guidelines for excellence for community engagement. But we also wanted to share with you that there are several other guidelines that you might not be familiar with. And on the NAAEE website, you can actually download by a PDF any of these guidelines that interest you. So there is a K-12 environmental ed guidelines. There's an early childhood guidelines. There is a guidelines for non-formal educators. There's also guidelines for professional development to make sure that you're teaching professional development in an appropriate way, and also one on environmental education materials. So we just wanted to share that if you like what we're talking about with these community engagement guidelines, you might also go to the website and look at those other guidelines and download or purchase some of those as well.
All right. And I will add to that, as you read about those guidelines, and I will say that the project that the guidelines have fallen under NAAEE really go way back to the mid-1990s, and has been a project that not only, as Janine has said, encompassed more and more areas of EE, but also many of those guidelines have been revised and are in the process of being revised as we grow and we change as a field. I wanted to mention here that I think that one of the things that I've always enjoyed about the guidelines in terms of trying to use them to convince other people that they would be ways of sort of standardizing what we do in environmental ed is that, first of all, they were not done in isolation. They were done through many, many, many meetings with lots and lots of folks through a strong public participatory process. That it got educators talking about environmental education through the lenses of what really works. For me, I like to use the term, well, actually, among other things, I would probably say it's what works and what are the common practices that we seem to fall on and depend on. So it's a lot of those kinds of things that were talked about, as well as then building environmental education as a true profession. And as you might suspect, promoting excellence.
All right, so these guidelines focus on several different things. They look at the environment, community well-being, sustainability, and resilience. So through this focus, we're actually trying to develop a community through these ideas. In a community, think of a community as a system. So you have like an ecological or a natural system. You also have a social system that includes things like housing and transportation. You have a governmental and an economic system. So thinking as a community as a system will kind of help you think about how these guidelines are organized. And these guidelines also provide suggestions for working in an inclusive environment, um, also giving ideas on social equity, how to build effective partnerships, and also coalition building.
Okay, let me just add to that then that in this particular set of guidelines, there were some characteristics that that we learned about when we went through the training that we felt like were really important for us to remember. And of course, obviously, being community centered is goes without saying. But actually, talking about what is it that we know about environmental education in terms of sound EE principles that not only includes what's good education, but also making sure that our programs are fair and that they are balanced and that they are education and not advocacy. As Janine's already mentioned, we want them to be collaborative, but also at the same time being incredibly inclusive. And eventually, what we're hoping is that what we'll have here is something that we'll be able to build on and will move people to want to do things together in terms of promoting a better environment in our community, and have that be something that will be a long-term investment itself.
So these 5 characteristics are really like the framework of this guide. And then under each characteristic are 3 to 5 guidelines. So this is an example of one of the guidelines that embody each characteristic. And then you also notice, so one of the guidelines you see is learn from and resolve conflict. But then you also have indicators. So these indicators, excuse me, or attributes are how you actually can achieve each of the characteristics in the guidelines themselves. So the indicators actually give you really good ideas on how to work towards learning from and resolving conflict, for example. There are also really great supporting resources in the guidelines. And so one of the things that we thought would be really helpful in establishing a community partnership in Bowling Green was looking at asset maps. And that's a good way of thinking about positive things that we already have as a community that we can actually look at and build on in a positive way. So that's one thing we actually decided to do. We did a small training with our group looking at the guidelines, and then we jumped into community asset maps and how to build one.
And let me add that I think that was one of the things that I think excited us the most about the training that NAAEE held and continues to hold, by the way, was that it helped us sort of identify a process that we thought would work in our area. And as Janine has said, we like this idea of asset mapping. And so I wanted to just sort of talk for a moment about that. It was kind of new to me. I think as I look back on it, it's probably had some ingredients that I've done before, but I hadn't done it really in the way that it was described in the training and the way that we were able to go through and model it with the leaders of the workshop. So here's a few of the things that we learned that we decided to embrace. And when we got our group together for the very first time, as Janine mentioned, this was one of the things we did that day. First of all, we wanted to make sure that everyone in the group realized that what we were trying to do was essentially identify what things are going on right now. We didn't want to spend a lot of time, at least that day, looking at, what we could do if we had a grant, or what we could do if we teamed with somebody else across the state, or what we could do if we brought in some expert from somewhere that could help us to get started. We wanted to essentially say, what is it that we have right now? And then build from that. And it sounds like a simple idea, and it is, but I think it's something sometimes that we don't often do, because I think sometimes we're looking, and of course, those of us in NAAEE, we're always looking for some extra resources. We're trying to find ways to have some things funded, sometimes externally, and that's great, don't get me wrong, but what we were trying to do here was to say, let's hold off on that for right now. So what we did, part of that first workshop that we had together, which was about a year ago now, is we basically looked at our area, our region, our little slice of Kentucky, if you will. And we said, okay, let's just literally brainstorm what we know of that's going on in environmental education in our area. And we pretty much didn't put any restrictions on that. We asked people to think in terms of people, places, organizations, programs, all sorts of things that could come to mind. And of course, we got some duplication, but we also got a lot of ideas from that group that day. And basically started out by, using the old sticky notes and just slapping them up. In some cases where they were happening, in other cases we found is after a while we we're sticking notes all over the place because we realize that some of the things we're looking at permeated a lot of different programs. The idea that way at Day was to try to just capture as much as we could. And with about, I think, 10 people that first meeting, we were really able to really generate a lot of ideas. And then what we did is after that, we began to sort of look at how that list may have had some commonalities. And so we combined some things into some categories. You can see 4 of those categories here on the screen. And I'm not going to talk about all these things. That really isn't our purpose today. But I think you'll see that as you might suspect, there were up here in the upper right-hand corner lots of organizations that were basically nonprofit organizations or organizations that were not funded by private enterprise. And then, of course, we had agencies, which sort of fall in that similar bailiwick, if you will. But then we also identified some business and industry entities that were doing some things in environmental aid. In some cases, some things that many of us were not aware of. And I mentioned Corvette earlier. We found out Corvette was involved in some educational activities in terms of creating a nature center near the plant and doing some things along those lines that many people did not know about. And then, of course, over here, we actually looked at specific places. And it was interesting because, for example, here you see an actual school that was named as a place. And you might wonder, well, why would you put a school down? Well, it turns out Richardsville Elementary School, oops, there we go. Richardsville Elementary School, which is in Warren County, which is the county that Bowling Green sits in, is the first school in the United States to ever go net zero in terms of their building. In other words, when they built that school about 10 years ago, they built it in such a way as they have no energy bill. In fact, because of the way the laws are structured here in this part of Kentucky, they actually generate more electricity than they use. And so the power company has to buy that back from them. And the school gets a check every quarter because the school's generating excess power. Because of that, many of the people that are associated with that school have made the school into a school that teaches, not unlike what we would do in a nature center or other kinds of facilities. But, you know, it was interesting. Not only did a lot of people not know about it, but they didn't realize that it was the first school in the United States to gain that net zero designation, which is pretty cool for a little rural school in Kentucky. So lots of things were learned that day, but more than anything, I think lots of linkages were made, and people began to look at how perhaps they doing what they do could help and team up with someone else that is doing other kinds of things, but may be connected to them in some way. I'll give you one example of those before we go forward. You see on this list, not only Mammoth Cave National Park, which is obviously a national park, part of the National Park Service, but also you see Friends of Mammoth Cave, which is a nonprofit. They learned during that meeting that some of the storm water management organizations in our area, along with Corvette, were in the process of taking groups of people to local streams to do stream investigations. And so they decided they wanted to join in. And so we ended up having, instead of 3 organizations doing that program, we ended up then in the next spring with 5 organizations doing it. And I think that's going to grow even more, and it impacts not just schools, but all sorts of non-formal programs as well. So that was kind of the way that that discussion not only started, but has begun. So the question is now, where are we now, and what do we want to do? Well, we've maintained our coalition. Little bit of a bumpy road with the pandemic because we haven't been able to get together physically. And I think that was one of the things we really enjoyed, that first part of our work together. But we're still getting together on Zoom. and we've talked a lot about how we've already identified new individuals and organizations that we could pull into the coalition. We're looking, though, at doing that in what we're calling concentric circles. In other words, we may want to have some people that will want to join into the core group and be a part of the group that meets and generates and does a lot of the work that I've just described to you. But there may be other people that want to be in more of an advisors, or perhaps people that would be resources that we could use, although they wouldn't necessarily be active members of the coalition itself. But more than that, I think we wanted to continue to identify and strengthen those links I mentioned a moment ago. And as you might suspect, now I think we're ready to also look at what are some of the things that we could do to raise money to provide funds for many of the programs that we're looking at, or maybe even some new programs that we haven't even thought of. And interestingly enough, the gentleman that runs our state agency, we have a Kentucky Environmental Education Council, which is a state agency here in Kentucky that coordinates environmental ed. They contacted us and asked us if we would be willing to help some other communities around the state get started with a coalition like ours, but also perhaps to join together and write some grant proposals so that as a group of communities, we might be able to get some funding to help with what we're doing as well. So that's kind of where we're at this particular point. It's only been a year, and we're enjoying what we're doing. It's been a really exciting thing for Janine and I to be able to work on, because as I said, we've spent probably most of our careers working in teacher education and with schools, not as much with community-based organizations. And this is a new thing, and we're basically just trying to facilitate it and help it grow. So, Janine, anything you'd like to say before we close?
Yeah, so just emphasizing what Terry was saying, that we're not really the leaders. Yes, we took the training, but what we really want to do is build those connections in the community and just act as facilitators, making connections between different groups, and hopefully also establishing some good environmental education into programs that already do some great education in our area, in the Barren River District.
All right, so if there's anything we can do for anyone in terms of providing more information or just having a discussion with you on what we're doing or what you're doing or what we might be able to share with each other, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our emails are there, and that would probably be a good place to start. Thanks again.
And yeah, thank you for attending our session.